The chains bit into Elena's wrists as the guards pulled her through the iron gates. She did not scream. She did not beg. She only stared straight ahead at the tall black doors of the cross fortress, her heart slamming against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through skin and bone. Behind her, the village she had grown up in was already a memory, swallowed by fog and distance. Ahead of her stood a fate she could not yet imagine. Her father's pack had failed to pay tribute to the ruling kingdom for the third year in a row. The Council of Elders had grown tired of empty promises and late payments. They wanted a lesson taught, a debt settled in flesh since coin had failed them. And so, without asking Elena a single question about her own life, her own wishes, her own fears, they had chosen her. She was the one who would pay for her father's failures. She was the one who would walk into the home of Alpha King Damian Cross, a man whose name alone made grown warriors lower their eyes. The guards said nothing as they marched her across the courtyard. Stone walls rose on every side, taller than any building she had ever seen, carved with symbols of wolves in battle, wolves in victory, wolves devouring their enemies. She tried to keep her breathing steady. She tried to remember that fear was a weakness, and weakness was something the Cross Pack would use against her the moment they smelled it. The great doors opened without a sound, as if they had been waiting for her. Inside, the air was colder than the courtyard, colder than the fog outside. Torches lined the long hall, their flames throwing shifting shadows across walls draped in dark banners. At the far end sat a throne carved from black stone, and on that throne sat the man she had heard whispered about since she was a child. Damian Cross did not rise when she entered. He did not so much as shift in his seat. His eyes, a striking shade of gold, followed her every step as the guards brought her forward and forced her to her knees before him. Elena refused to look away. She had decided somewhere in the long carriage ride to his territory that she would not give him the satisfaction of watching her break. "So, this is the payment," he said, his voice low and even, carrying easily through the silent hall. "A girl." "I am not a payment," Elena said before she could stop herself. "I am a person." A murmur rippled through the guards standing along the walls. Nobody spoke to the Alpha King that way. Nobody dared. But Damian only tilted his head slightly, studying her as though she were a puzzle he had not expected to find interesting. "You have spirit," he said. "That will not save you from your father's debt, but it may keep you alive longer than I expected." He rose then, and Elena realized just how much larger he was up close, how the air around him seemed to bend slightly, charged with a power she could almost feel against her skin. He walked down the steps of the throne slowly, circling her once, the way a predator studies something it has not yet decided whether to devour. "You belong to me now," he said. "Your family's debt is paid. Your freedom is not." Elena's jaw tightened. "What does that mean? What do you intend to do with me?" "That," Damian said, turning back toward his throne, "depends entirely on you." He gave a small motion with his hand, and two guards stepped forward to pull Elena to her feet. She did not fight them. There was no point in fighting men twice her size in a fortress she did not know, surrounded by wolves loyal only to the king who had just claimed ownership of her life. As they led her away, she glanced back once. Damian was already seated again, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond her, as if she had already been forgotten. The room they gave her was nothing like she expected. She had imagined a cell, damp stone, perhaps chains bolted to a wall. Instead, she found a chamber with a large bed, a hearth already lit, and a window that looked out over the dark forest surrounding the fortress. It was beautiful in a cold, distant way, the way everything in this place seemed to be, beautiful and untouchable. The door locked from the outside. She heard the bolt slide into place the moment the guards left her alone. Elena sat on the edge of the bed and finally let herself shake, just for a moment, just long enough to release the fear she had been holding since the elders announced her name in the village square. Then she stood, wiped her face, and began to examine every corner of the room, every possible way out, every crack in the stone. There was none. The window was too high, the drop too steep, the door too solid. She was, in every sense that mattered, a prisoner. Days passed in a strange and unsettling rhythm. A servant girl named Lily brought her meals 3 times a day, always polite, always quiet, never answering questions about the king or the fortress or what was expected of Elena. Lily seemed almost afraid to speak at all, glancing toward the door as though someone might be listening even when the halls outside were empty. "Please," Elena said one evening, as Lily set down a tray of bread and stew, "just tell me what he wants from me. Am I to be a servant? A prisoner? What is my purpose here?" Lily hesitated, her hands twisting the edge of her apron. "The king does not explain himself," she finally said. "Not to me, not to anyone. Has he done this before? Brought someone here as payment?" "No," Lily said, and something in her voice made Elena look up sharply. "Never. Not since." She stopped herself, pressing her lips together. "Since what?" But Lily only shook her head and hurried from the room, leaving Elena with more questions than she had started with. That night, Elena lay awake staring at the ceiling, turning over every word, every glance, every strange detail of her arrival. Damian Cross was not what she had expected. The stories painted him as a monster, a ruthless king who crushed anyone who defied him, who ruled through fear and violence alone. Yet the man she had met, cold as he was, had not raised a hand against her. He had not threatened her with pain or humiliation. He had simply claimed her, as if she were a piece of property to be stored away and considered later. Somehow, that felt more unsettling than outright cruelty would have. A week into her captivity, the guards outside her door changed their rotation, and one afternoon, the bolt slid open earlier than usual. Elena tensed, expecting Lily with her tray, but instead found herself facing a guard she did not recognize, tall and broad-shouldered, his expression unreadable. "The king wishes to see you," he said simply. Elena's stomach twisted, but she rose and followed him without protest. There was no use resisting a man built like a mountain. Not in a fortress she had no hope of escaping. They walked through corridors she had not seen before, past training grounds where warriors sparred with wooden blades, past a library filled with more books than Elena had ever seen in one place. Finally, they reached a smaller room, warmer than the throne hall, with a fire crackling in the hearth and a table set with food. Damian sat at the table already, a cup in his hand, watching the flames rather than the door. He did not look up immediately when Elena entered, and for a moment she simply stood there, unsure whether to speak or wait. "Sit," he said finally, gesturing to the chair across from him. Elena sat, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap. "Why did you bring me here?" "You have not eaten a proper meal since you arrived," he said, ignoring her question. "Lily tells me you barely touch your food." "Forgive me if captivity has ruined my appetite." Something flickered across his face, there and gone so quickly. Elena almost missed it. Was that amusement? Surely not. The Alpha King did not find humor in the suffering of the girl he had taken as payment for a debt. "You are not a prisoner in chains," Damian said, setting down his cup. "You will not be beaten. You will not be starved. Whatever stories you were told about my kingdom, understand that I do not rule through senseless cruelty." "Then how do you rule?" Elena asked, unable to hide the challenge in her voice. "Because from where I sit, taking a girl from her home to settle her father's debts sounds cruel enough." Damian's gaze finally met hers, steady and unblinking. "The world is not gentle, Elena. Debts must be paid. Consequences must be enforced, or every pack under my rule will believe they can ignore their obligations without punishment. You are here because balance must be maintained. That is not cruelty. That is survival. And what happens to me now? Am I to live in that room forever, waiting for you to decide my fate?" "You will remain here," Damian said. "You will be safe. You will be fed. Beyond that, Your future is not yet decided. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to demand more answers, but something in his tone told her this conversation had reached its end. She ate in silence after that, aware of his eyes occasionally drifting toward her, though every time she looked up, he had already turned away. As the weeks passed, a strange routine settled over her days. She was permitted to walk certain parts of the fortress under guard, always watched but no longer confined entirely to her chamber. She discovered the library and spent hours there, losing herself in books about the history of the Pax, the wars fought between territories, the rise of the Cross bloodline to power. She learned that Damien's family had ruled the northern territories for 3 generations, each king more feared than the last. She also learned, through careful questions to Lily and the guards who slowly grew more comfortable around her, that Damien had once had a mate. The information came in fragments, never a full story, always cut short before Lily could finish. A mate who was gone now, though no one would say how or why. Elena found herself thinking about it more than she wanted to admit, wondering what kind of woman could have captured the attention of a man as guarded as Damien Cross, and what had happened to make him the cold, distant king he was now. One evening, a storm rolled in over the fortress, thunder cracking against the mountains, rain hammering the stone walls. Elena sat by her window watching lightning split the sky, unable to sleep with the noise outside. She heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, pausing outside her door. She waited, holding her breath, expecting the bolt to slide open. It never did. The footsteps remained there for a long while before finally retreating. The next morning, she asked one of the guards who had been posted outside her room during the storm. He hesitated before answering. "The king does not sleep well during storms," he said quietly. "He often walks the halls at night." It was likely nothing more than that. Elena did not believe it was nothing. She could not explain why, but something about the image of Damien Cross standing outside her door in the middle of a storm, saying nothing, doing nothing, simply standing there, settled into her mind and refused to leave. Days later, she found herself in the training yard, watching the warriors spar, when Damien appeared beside her without warning, his presence as silent and sudden as always. "You watch them closely," he observed. "I have nothing else to do," Elena said. "A prisoner needs some form of entertainment." "You are not," he started, then stopped himself, exhaling slowly. "You could learn, if you wished, to defend yourself." Elena turned to look at him fully, surprised. "You would teach me?" "I did not say I would teach you," Damien said, though something in his voice suggested he was considering it. "I said you could learn. There is a difference." "From who, then? One of your guards?" "Perhaps," he said, and then, after a pause that felt longer than it should have, "perhaps myself." Elena did not know what to say to that. The offer felt strange coming from a man who had barely spoken more than a handful of sentences to her since her arrival, a man who kept himself locked behind walls as thick as the stone surrounding his fortress. But there was something in his expression, some flicker of consideration that told her he was not simply toying with her. He meant it, or at least, he was willing to mean it. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you offer that to someone you consider a debt to be paid?" Damien's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment Elena thought he would not answer at all. "Because," he said finally, "you remind me that not everyone in this world bends the moment they are afraid. That is a rare thing, rarer than you might think." He left without another word, walking back toward the fortress with the same measured, unreadable stride he always carried, leaving Elena standing in the training yard with more questions circling her mind than answers, and a strange, unfamiliar warmth she did not want to name settling somewhere behind her ribs. That night, for the first time since her arrival, Elena did not lie awake dreading the days ahead. Instead, she found herself wondering what tomorrow might bring, and whether the ruthless king everyone feared might be something else entirely, hidden beneath layers of duty and grief she was only beginning to understand. She did not yet know how deep that hidden part of him would pull her in, nor how far she would go once she began to see the man beneath the crown. But that night, staring up at the same ceiling she had stared at every night since arriving, Elena allowed herself, just once, to feel something other than fear. She felt curious, and curiosity, she would soon learn, was far more dangerous than fear had ever been. Morning came with a strange lightness in Elena's chest, one she did not fully understand and did not trust. She dressed quickly, pulling on the simple gray dress Lily had left for her, and made her way to the door before the guards had even come to escort her. When it opened, she found not the usual pair of silent warriors, but a single guard she recognized from the training yard the day before. "The king asked that I bring you to the eastern courtyard," he said. "He is waiting." Elena's pulse quickened, though she told herself it was only nerves, only the uncertainty of what training with the Alpha King might actually involve. She followed the guard through corridors bathed in early morning light, past windows that looked out over a forest turning gold with the changing season, until they reached an open courtyard surrounded by high stone walls. Damien stood in the center, sleeves rolled to his forearms, a wooden practice blade resting against his shoulder. He looked different in the morning light, less like the distant king on his throne, and more like a man, solid and present, watching her approach with an expression she could not quite read. "You came," he said, as if he had expected her to refuse. "You offered," Elena replied. "I am not in the habit of turning down useful things, even from you." A corner of his mouth lifted, so briefly she almost missed it. He tossed her a practice blade, and she caught it clumsily, nearly dropping it before adjusting her grip. "We begin with balance," Damien said, stepping closer. "Before you learn to strike, you must learn to stand so that you cannot be knocked down." The lesson that followed was unlike anything Elena had expected. Damien was patient in a way that surprised her, correcting her stance with careful instruction rather than harsh criticism, guiding her hands into position without unnecessary force. When she stumbled, he did not mock her. When she finally managed to hold her ground against a gentle push from him, something like approval crossed his face, quiet but unmistakable. "Again," he said, and she obeyed, feeling a strange satisfaction settle into her muscles with each repetition. They trained for nearly an hour before Damien called an end to the session, both of them breathing hard, sweat cooling on Elena's skin despite the crisp autumn air. She set down the practice blade and looked at him, really looked at him, searching for the monster the stories had promised her. She did not find one. "You fight better than I expected," Damien said, taking the blade from her hands, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment. Elena felt the contact more than she wanted to admit, a small spark that lingered even after he stepped away. "I had a good teacher," she said before she could stop herself. Something shifted in his expression, softening at the edges, though it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "Do not grow too comfortable," he said, turning to leave. "Tomorrow we begin again, and I will not be gentle a second time." Despite his warning, Elena found herself looking forward to the next morning more than she expected. Their training sessions became a fixture in her days, a small pocket of normalcy carved out of an otherwise strange and uncertain existence. She learned to hold a blade properly, to move with purpose rather than panic, to read an opponent's stance before they struck. But more than that, she learned Damien, piece by careful piece, in the quiet moments between lessons. She learned that he preferred silence to unnecessary conversation, but that his silence was not coldness so much as caution, as though he had learned long ago that words could be weapons turned against him. She learned that he rose before dawn each day, walking the fortress walls alone before anyone else woke, checking every gate and every guard post himself rather than trusting the task to others. She learned that despite his reputation, the servants who worked in his household did not fear him the way outsiders assumed they would. They respected him, certainly, but there was an ease in how they spoke around him that suggested years of fair treatment rather than cruelty. One afternoon, Weeks into her training, Elena found herself in the library again, curled into a window seat with a book about the founding of the Northern Territories. She had not heard the door open, and she startled slightly when Damien's voice broke the silence. "You spend more time in here than anyone else in this fortress," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Books do not ask questions I cannot answer," Elena said, marking her page and setting the book aside. "Unlike everyone else here." Damien moved closer, glancing at the shelves around them before his gaze settled back on her. "What questions have you been asked?" "Whether I am afraid of you," Elena said honestly. "Lily asks it every few days, as though she expects the answer to change." "And does it?" Elena considered the question carefully before answering. "I was afraid of you," she admitted. "The day I arrived, I thought I might not survive the week. But now," she paused, unsure how much honesty she wanted to offer him. "Now I am not sure fear is the right word for what I feel." Damien's expression grew unreadable again, though he did not look away from her. "What word would you use instead?" "I do not know yet," Elena said. "Perhaps I will figure it out eventually." The silence between them stretched, charged with something neither of them named, until Damien finally cleared his throat and gestured toward the shelves. "There is a section on the history of mate bonds, if you are curious about our traditions. I imagine you have questions about that as well." Elena's breath caught slightly at the mention of mate bonds, remembering the fragments Lily had shared about a woman from Damien's past, a mate who was gone now, though no one would explain how. She wanted to ask, wanted to push past the careful walls he kept around himself, but something in his tone told her the topic was not one he wished to discuss. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. "I will look into it," she said instead, and Damien nodded, turning to leave, though he paused at the door. "Elena," he said, using her name for what felt like the first time since her arrival, rather than addressing her as though she were simply an obligation to be managed. "Thank you for not running when the guards changed their posts last week. I know the opportunity was there." Elena blinked, surprised he had noticed, surprised he had known at all. "Where would I have run to?" she asked. "This is my life now. I would rather understand it than flee from it blindly." Something in his gaze softened further, though he said nothing more before leaving her alone with her book and her thoughts, both of which had grown far more complicated than she ever expected them to become. As autumn deepened into the first chill of winter, Elena's world inside the fortress expanded in small but meaningful ways. She was permitted to walk the grounds without a guard shadowing every step, trusted enough now that the warriors who once eyed her with suspicion had grown accustomed to her presence among them. She helped Lily in the kitchen some mornings, not out of obligation, but because the quiet, simple work gave her hands something to do, while her mind turned over the strange shape her life had taken. She also began noticing things about Damien that unsettled her in ways she did not expect. The way his shoulders tensed whenever certain topics arose in conversation among his advisors. The way he sometimes stood at the edge of gatherings, present but distant, as though some part of him remained locked away where no one could reach it. The way his guards spoke of him with a loyalty that went beyond duty, a loyalty earned rather than demanded. One evening, during a council meeting Elena was not meant to overhear, she caught fragments of conversation drifting from the throne hall as she passed through the corridor outside. Voices raised, tense with disagreement. "The northern packs grow restless, my king," one advisor said. "They see the girl in your household and wonder what it means for your judgment." "My judgment is not compromised," Damien's voice replied, low and controlled, though Elena could hear the edge beneath it. "The debt was paid. She remains under my protection as agreed." "Protection," another voice repeated, skeptical. "Is that truly all it is?" The silence that followed stretched long enough that Elena found herself holding her breath outside the door, waiting for Damien's response. When it came, his voice had grown quieter, harder to hear. "That is all it needs to be," he said. "Nothing more." Elena stepped away from the door before anyone could discover her listening. her chest tight with an emotion she refused to name. She told herself his words meant nothing, that of course he would deny anything more to his advisors, that the politics of his kingdom demanded careful answers, regardless of private truths. But some small, unguarded part of her had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that his answer might have been different. She avoided the training yard the next morning, choosing instead to remain in her chamber, staring out at the frost gathering on the window pane. When a knock came at her door sometime past midday, she expected Lily with a meal tray. Instead, she found Damien standing in the hallway, his expression uncharacteristically uncertain. "You did not come this morning," he said. "I did not feel like training," Elena replied, arms crossed, unwilling to explain the true reason for her absence. Damien studied her for a long moment, and Elena wondered if he somehow knew she had overheard the council meeting, if her carefully guarded expression was not as guarded as she believed. "Walk with me," he said finally, and though it was not quite a request, it was gentler than a command. They walked in silence through the fortress halls, out into the courtyard where frost coated the stone beneath their feet. Damien did not speak until they reached the edge of the wall overlooking the forest below, the same view Elena had admired from her window countless times. "My advisors worry that your presence here weakens my authority," he said finally, staring out at the trees rather than at her. "They believe a king who shows mercy to a payment debt is a king who can be manipulated." "And what do you believe?" Elena asked quietly. Damien turned to face her then, his golden eyes steady despite the cold wind pulling at his dark hair. "I believe," he said slowly, "that mercy and weakness are not the same thing, no matter what my council fears. But I also know that some truths are dangerous to speak aloud too soon, especially in a court as watchful as mine." Elena understood, then, the careful denial she had overheard the night before. It was not a rejection of whatever was growing between them. It was protection, the same instinct that kept him walking the fortress walls alone before dawn, the same instinct that had kept his guard up since the moment she arrived. He was not denying her, he was shielding her, and perhaps shielding himself as well, from a court that would use any perceived weakness against them both. "I am not afraid of your counsel," Elena said. "Perhaps you should be," Damien replied, though there was no true warning in his tone, only a tired honesty. "But I find myself grateful, more than I expected to be, that you are not." The wind picked up around them, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow, and for a moment neither of them spoke, simply standing together at the edge of the wall, closer than propriety or politics would have allowed weeks earlier. Elena did not know what this meant for either of them, did not know how a punishment could have shifted into something that felt, increasingly, like the opposite of one. But standing there beside Damien Cross, watching the sun sink behind the frozen trees, she found she was no longer afraid to find out. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the wind howl against her window, Elena realized the walls she had built around her own heart since arriving at the fortress had begun to crack, slowly, quietly, without her permission. She did not yet know whether that was a comfort or a danger. But she suspected, deep down, that she was about to find out which one it truly was, and that there would be no going back once she did. The first snow fell 3 days later, blanketing the fortress grounds in white, and forcing training sessions indoors, into a wide stone hall Elena had never entered before. Weapons lined the walls, ancient and new alike, and portraits of past Cross kings watched over the space, with painted eyes that seemed to follow her every movement. Damien moved through the cold air like it did not touch him at all, while Elena wrapped her cloak tighter around her shoulders and tried not to shiver. "You are distracted," Damien observed, catching her wooden blade easily as she swung it toward him, disarming her with barely any effort. "I am cold," Elena said, though it was only half true. The other half of her distraction had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with the man standing across from her, close enough now that she could see the faint scar along his jaw she had never noticed before. Cold is a weakness an enemy will use against you, Damien said, though his voice had softened from the sharp instruction of their earlier sessions. He stepped closer, adjusting her grip on the blade with careful hands. You must learn to fight through discomfort, not around it. His fingers lingered a moment longer than necessary against hers, and Elena felt her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with the exercise. When she looked up, she found Damien watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Gone the instant he realized she had noticed, replaced by the familiar guarded distance he wore like armor. They finished the session in near silence after that, both of them careful to avoid whatever had passed between them, though neither could fully ignore it either. That evening, an urgent horn sounded from the fortress gates, cutting through the quiet of the settling night. Elena rushed to her window, watching guards scramble across the courtyard below, torches lit against the growing darkness. She heard shouting, the clash of metal, chaos erupting in a place that had felt, only hours earlier, calm and orderly. Her door burst open moments later, and Lily rushed inside, pale and breathless. Someone attacked the king, she gasped. Within the walls, a traitor among the guards. Elena's heart dropped. Is he alive? Lily said quickly, but injured. They have taken him to his chambers. Without thinking, without weighing the danger or the impropriety, Elena pushed past Lily and ran through the corridors toward the sound of raised voices, following the trail of guards rushing in the same direction. She found Damien's chamber surrounded by warriors, their faces tight with worry and fury in equal measure. She pushed through them before anyone could stop her, ignoring the protests behind her, and found Damien seated on the edge of his bed, a healer pressing cloth against a wound along his ribs while he waved away further assistance with visible irritation. You should not be here, he said the moment he saw her, though there was no real force behind the words. Neither should you have nearly gotten yourself killed, Elena shot back, moving closer despite the healer's protest, kneeling beside the bed to examine the wound herself. It was deep, though not as severe as the amount of blood suggested, already beginning to close thanks to the accelerated healing every wolf possessed. Still, her hands trembled slightly as she helped steady the cloth against his side. An assassin, Damien said quietly, answering the question she had not yet asked. Hidden among the new recruits. He nearly succeeded. Who sent him? I do not yet know, Damien admitted, his jaw tight with restrained anger. But I intend to find out. Elena studied the wound a moment longer before finally looking up at him, searching his face for the pain he was clearly trying to hide behind careful composure. You could have died. I did not, Damien said simply, though something in his gaze softened as it met hers, some acknowledgement of the fear she had not bothered to hide when she burst through the door moments earlier. That is not an answer, Elena said, her voice unsteady despite her best efforts to control it. Damien reached out then, his hand covering hers where it still rested against the cloth at his side, warm despite the chill that had settled over the room. I am alive because of quick reflexes and years of training, he said. But I will admit, the sight of you running through that door meant more to me than I expected it to. Elena's breath caught at the honesty in his words, at the vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show. She did not pull her hand away, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the chaos outside the room fading into distant, unimportant noise. The healer cleared his throat awkwardly, breaking the moment, and Elena finally stepped back, allowing him to finish his work while she retreated to the far side of the room, her heart still pounding from more than just the earlier fear. The investigation into the attack consumed the fortress over the following days. Guards were questioned, loyalties tested, and the traitor who had slipped an assassin among the new recruits was discovered to have connections to a rival alpha from the Western Territories, a man named Callum Ashworth, who had long resented the growing power of the Cross bloodline. Elena listened carefully to every fragment of information she could gather, aware that whatever conflict was brewing extended far beyond the walls of the fortress, and that she had somehow become tangled within it. During one of the council meetings that followed, Elena was summoned to attend, an unusual request that surprised everyone in the room, including Damien himself. She stood near the back of the hall as the advisors debated their next course of action, feeling every eye occasionally drift toward her with poorly concealed suspicion. The girl should not be present for matters of state, one advisor argued, an older man with silver hair and sharp, calculating eyes. Her presence here only invites further speculation about her influence. She saved my life during the attack, Damien said, his voice carrying easily through the hall, silencing the murmurs that followed. Her instincts proved more valuable than half the guards stationed at my door. Elena had not saved his life, not truly, but she understood the weight of his words, the deliberate choice to elevate her standing before a court that viewed her as nothing more than a temporary obligation. The advisor did not argue further, though his expression remained skeptical as the meeting continued. Afterward, as the hall emptied and Elena prepared to leave as well, Damien caught her arm gently, holding her back until they were alone. "Why did you say that?" Elena asked. "I did not save your life. You came running toward danger instead of away from it," Damien said. "In my experience, that is a rare enough quality to be worth defending, regardless of the exact details." Elena studied him carefully, searching for the calculation she expected to find, the political maneuvering that likely motivated every decision a king made. She found none. Only honesty, plain and unguarded, the same honesty he had shown her in the moments after the attack. "You are not what I expected," she admitted quietly. "When I first arrived here, I believed every story I had ever heard about you. And now? Now I am not certain those stories were ever entirely true," Elena said. "Or perhaps they were true once, before something changed you." Something flickered across Damien's expression, quick and sharp, gone before Elena could fully identify it. Grief, perhaps, or the memory of grief long buried beneath years of careful control. "Some changes are not choices," he said quietly. "Some are simply survival." He did not elaborate further, and Elena did not push, though the weight of his words settled into her chest. Another piece of the puzzle she was slowly assembling, one careful conversation at a time. Winter deepened around the fortress in the weeks that followed, and with it, the strange, undeniable pull between Elena and Damien grew harder to ignore. Their training sessions extended longer than necessary, conversations lingering well past the point where either of them needed to remain. Meals that once passed in careful silence, now filled with genuine conversation, questions asked and answered with an openness neither of them had shown in the early days of Elena's captivity. One evening, as snow fell steadily outside the library windows, Elena found herself seated across from Damien at a small table near the fire, a chessboard between them, though neither had made a move in several minutes. "You are stalling," Damien said, a rare hint of amusement in his voice. "I am strategizing," Elena corrected, though she had, in truth, lost track of the game entirely, her attention caught instead on the way firelight softened the sharp angles of his face. "Your strategy involves staring at me instead of the board," Damien observed, and Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks at being caught so plainly. "Perhaps I find you more interesting than chess," she admitted, deciding boldness suited her better than embarrassment. Damien's gaze sharpened, something raw and unguarded passing across his features before he could hide it away. "Elena," he said quietly, her name carrying a weight it had not held before. "There are things about me, about what happened before you arrived, that you do not yet understand." "Then tell me," Elena said. "I am tired of half answers and careful silences." Damien was quiet for a long moment, the fire crackling between them, before he finally spoke. "I had a mate once," he said, "before you arrived. Her name was Margaret, and she died 3 years ago, in circumstances I do not speak of, not even to my closest advisors." Elena's chest tightened, understanding at last the source of the careful distance he kept. the guarded walls he had built around himself since the moment she arrived. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I have not spoken of her to anyone in a long time," Damien continued. "I have not wanted to. Not until now. There is something about you, Elena, that makes silence feel like the wrong choice." The admission hung between them. Heavy with meaning, neither of them was ready to fully name. Elena reached across the table, her hand covering his where it rested near the abandoned chessboard, and for the first time since her arrival at the fortress, neither of them pulled away from the quiet, undeniable connection settling between them. "Whatever this is," Elena said carefully, "I do not think it began as punishment anymore." Damien's fingers tightened around hers, gentle but sure. "No," he agreed quietly. "I do not think it did." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the fortress in white silence, while inside, beside a dying fire, something new and fragile had begun to take root between a girl who arrived as payment for a debt and a king who had long believed himself incapable of feeling anything beyond duty and grief again. News of Callum Ashworth's involvement in the assassination attempt spread quickly through the Northern Territories, carried by messengers and whispered among the packs loyal to the Cross bloodline. Damien's advisors urged caution, believing the Western Alpha would strike again once his first attempt had failed, though none of them expected the method he would choose next. It happened on a morning that began like any other, frost coating the courtyard, the scent of bread drifting from the kitchens where Elena had gone to help Lily prepare the morning meal. She had grown comfortable in the fortress in ways she never expected, comfortable enough that when the alarm bells rang out across the grounds, her first instinct was confusion rather than fear. That confusion shattered the moment she stepped outside and saw the chaos unfolding near the outer gates. Warriors shouted orders, horses were saddled in a hurry, and somewhere in the commotion, Elena heard her own name being called with an urgency that made her blood run cold. "They took her," a guard was shouting to Damien, who had emerged from the training hall with his blade already in hand, expression darker than Elena had ever seen it. During the supply delivery, Ashworth's men, disguised as merchants. Elena froze, uncertain who they were discussing, until Lily grabbed her arm, pulling her back toward the kitchen entrance with wide, panicked eyes. "They think it was you at first," Lily whispered urgently. "But it was Anna, one of the kitchen girls. She resembles you enough from a distance, especially wrapped in a cloak." They took her by mistake. The realization hit Elena like a physical blow. Someone had been taken in her place, mistaken for her, likely because Ashworth's spies had grown careless in their information, or Anna had simply been standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Guilt flooded through her, sharp and immediate, followed quickly by fear for a girl she barely knew, but who now faced danger meant for her. Damien's voice cut through the chaos, commanding immediate silence among his warriors. "We ride within the hour," he said. "Ashworth wanted the girl in my household. He will not harm her immediately if he believes she is valuable leverage. That gives us time, but not much of it." Elena pushed forward before she could stop herself, ignoring Lily's protest, until she stood before Damien directly. "I am coming with you." "Absolutely not," Damien said immediately, his tone leaving no room for argument. Though Elena had never been particularly good at accepting orders she disagreed with. "She was taken because they believed she was me," Elena said fiercely. "I will not sit safely inside these walls while an innocent girl suffers for my sake." "You will be a distraction I cannot afford," Damien said, though something in his eyes betrayed the conflict raging beneath his composed exterior. "If Ashworth realizes his mistake and sees you approaching, he may use the opportunity to take you as well, and then I will have lost everything I rode out to protect." The words hung between them, more revealing than either of them had time to acknowledge in the chaos of the moment. Elena softened slightly, understanding the fear beneath his refusal, though her resolve did not waver. "Then let me help in a way that does not put me directly in danger," she said. "I know the layout of Ashworth's territory better than you might think. I overheard conversations in the library, maps discussed among the visiting merchants who traveled through his lands before arriving here. I can help plan the route, help identify where they are most likely holding her. Damien studied her for a long moment, weighing the offer against his instinct to keep her locked safely within the fortress walls. Finally, he nodded once, sharp and decisive. You will remain here, in the war room, working with my advisors to identify the most likely location. You will not leave these walls. It was not everything Elena wanted, but it was enough, and she accepted the compromise with a small, grateful nod before rushing toward the war room where maps of the Western territories were already being unrolled across a wide table. The following hours passed in a blur of urgent strategy, Elena poring over maps alongside Damien's advisors, recalling every detail she had overheard from merchants and travelers during her months in the fortress. She identified a cluster of buildings near the border, a former trading post that had fallen into disuse years earlier, mentioned once by a merchant complaining about the abandoned structures cluttering the western roads. It fits the pattern, one advisor admitted reluctantly, studying the map where Elena had pointed. Isolated enough to avoid detection, close enough to the border for a quick escape if needed. Damien, who had returned briefly to gather additional warriors before departing, studied the location with sharp focus before nodding once. We ride there first, he said. If we are wrong, we adjust. But it is the best lead we have. Before he left, he found Elena alone in the war room, the other advisors having stepped out to prepare the remaining warriors for departure. He crossed the distance between them quickly, his hand rising to cup her face with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the urgency of the situation surrounding them. I will bring her back, he said, and I will return to you, Elena. I promise you that. You had better, Elena said, her voice unsteady despite her attempt at composure. I am not finished being frustrated with you yet. A ghost of a smile crossed his face, brief but genuine, before he pressed a kiss to her forehead and turned to leave, disappearing into the chaos of warriors preparing for a rescue mission that would determine far more than the fate of one kidnapped girl. The wait that followed was the longest of Elena's life. She remained in the fortress, pacing the halls, unable to focus on books or meals or any of the small comforts that had once filled her days. Lily stayed close, offering quiet company, though even her presence could not fully ease the anxious tension coiled tight in Elena's chest. Word arrived 2 days later, carried by an exhausted messenger who rode through the gates just as dawn broke over the mountains. Elena rushed to the courtyard, heart pounding, uncertain what news awaited her. The trading post had indeed been the location, exactly as Elena predicted. Damien's warriors had struck at nightfall, catching Ashworth's men by surprise before they could react. Anna, frightened but unharmed, had been recovered safely, along with several of Ashworth's men taken as prisoners for questioning. Ashworth himself had fled before the attack, escaping into the deeper forests of his territory, though the message assured Elena that Damien's forces continued to pursue him. Relief flooded through Elena so intensely her knees nearly buckled, though the messenger's next words tightened her chest once more. The king was injured during the rescue, the messenger said carefully. Not severely, but he insisted on remaining to oversee the pursuit rather than returning immediately for treatment. Elena did not wait for further details. She gathered supplies quickly, healing herbs and clean bandages Lily helped her assemble, and requested an escort to ride out and meet the returning party, ignoring the advisors who protested that such action was unnecessary and improper for someone in her position. I do not care what is proper, Elena said firmly. I am going, with or without an escort. Faced with her determination, the guards relented, providing horses and a small escort to accompany her toward the border, where Damien's forces were expected to return. The ride was tense, cold wind biting at her cheeks as she pushed the horse faster than perhaps was wise, desperate to see with her own eyes that Damien was truly alive and safe. She found the returning party several hours later, Damien riding at the front despite a visible wound along his shoulder, bandaged hastily but clearly still troubling him. His expression shifted the moment he spotted her approaching, surprise quickly giving way to something warmer, softer, unguarded in a way Elena had rarely witnessed from him. She dismounted before her horse had fully stopped, rushing toward him as he swung down from his own mount, ignoring the pain that flickered across his face at the sudden movement. "You are hurt," Elena said, her hands immediately checking the bandage at his shoulder, relief and worry warring within her chest. "It is nothing serious," Damien said, though he made no move to pull away from her careful examination. "Ashworth's men fought harder than expected, but we recovered Anna safely and secured several prisoners who will provide valuable information about his remaining forces. You should not have stayed to oversee the pursuit with an injury like this," Elena scolded, though her tone carried more relief than anger. "I could not leave the task unfinished," Damien said simply. "Not when the safety of my people depended on it." Elena studied him carefully, noting the exhaustion beneath his composed exterior, the toll the mission had clearly taken despite his attempts to hide it. "Your people," she repeated softly. "Am I among them now?" Damien's hand rose to cover hers where it still rested against his bandaged shoulder, his expression growing serious in a way that stole the breath from her lungs. "You have been among them for longer than either of us was willing to admit," he said. "Perhaps since the very day you arrived, refusing to bow before a king everyone else feared." The admission settled warmly into Elena's chest, chasing away the last of the anxious tension that had gripped her since the moment she learned of Anna's kidnapping. Around them, warriors continued their preparations to return to the fortress, prisoners secured and supplies gathered, but for a brief moment, none of that mattered beyond the quiet understanding passing between them. "Come," Damien said finally, guiding her back toward the horses. "Let us return home, where I can properly rest and you can properly scold me for my recklessness." Elena laughed despite herself, the sound surprising even her after the tension of the past 2 days. "I intend to do exactly that," she said, "for quite a long while." As they rode back toward the fortress together, the western sky beginning to clear after days of tension and danger, Elena found herself reflecting on how far they had come since her arrival months earlier, dragged through the fortress gates as nothing more than payment for a debt she had never chosen to owe. Somewhere along the way, that payment had transformed into something else entirely, something neither punishment nor obligation, but a bond neither of them had expected nor fully understood until circumstances forced them to confront it directly. She did not yet know what challenges still awaited them, what political maneuvering Ashworth would attempt next, or how the court would ultimately receive a bond growing stronger with each passing day. But riding beside Damien through the frost-covered forest, his hand occasionally finding hers along the reins, Elena felt, for the first time since her arrival, that whatever came next, they would face it together. The fortress settled into an uneasy calm in the weeks following the rescue, though calm proved to be a fragile thing given the shadow Callum Ashworth continued to cast over the northern territories. Reports trickled in from scouts stationed along the western border, describing increased activity within Ashworth's lands, gatherings of warriors that suggested preparation for something larger than a single failed kidnapping attempt. Damien's shoulder healed steadily under Elena's careful attention, though he grumbled each time she insisted on changing the bandage or applying fresh herbs to speed the process. She had taken to spending her evenings in his private study rather than her own chamber, a shift neither of them acknowledged aloud, but both accepted without question, as natural as breathing. "You worry too much," Damien said one evening, watching her pace the length of his study, while reports from the border lay scattered across his desk. "Someone should worry," Elena replied. "You seem determined to treat every threat as a minor inconvenience rather than the danger it actually represents." "I have faced threats before," Damien said, though his tone carried less confidence than his words suggested. "Ashworth is persistent, but he is not the first enemy to challenge my rule, and he will not be the last." "That does not mean I have to like it," Elena said, finally settling into the chair across from his desk, exhaustion from weeks of tension finally catching up with her. Every report that arrives makes my chest tighten with dread. Damien's expression softened, and he rose from his seat, moving around the desk to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. I promise you, Elena, I will not let Ashworth or anyone else take what has become most precious to me. The words settled warmly into her chest, though the weight of unspoken meaning behind them left her breathless. And what exactly has become most precious to you? She asked softly, though she already suspected the answer. You know the answer to that, Damien said, his golden eyes steady and unguarded in a way that had become increasingly familiar over recent weeks. I have known it for some time, though I have been reluctant to speak it plainly, given everything that stands between us. What stands between us? Elena asked. The debt has long since been forgotten in everything but title. I no longer feel like a prisoner within these walls, Damien. I feel like I belong here, with you. Something shifted in his expression at her words, raw and vulnerable in a way she had rarely witnessed from the composed king who ruled the northern territories with quiet, unshakable authority. There is a bond, he said carefully, that exists between certain wolves, stronger than mere attraction or affection. My advisors would call it fate. I have spent years believing myself incapable of experiencing it again, not after losing Margaret. Elena's breath caught, understanding the weight of what he was attempting to explain. Are you saying that you believe we share such a bond? I am saying, Damien replied, that since the moment you defied me in my own throne room, refusing to bow despite every reason to fear me, I have felt something I believed died alongside my first mate. I did not want to name it, not until I was certain, not until circumstances allowed me the freedom to consider what it might mean for both of us. And now? Elena asked, her heart pounding as she searched his face for any hesitation, any doubt that might explain his careful reluctance. Now, Damien said, rising slightly to press his forehead gently against hers, I find myself unable to imagine my life continuing without you in it, regardless of the danger our bond might invite from enemies like Ashworth. Elena closed the small distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that felt inevitable, the culmination of months spent slowly dismantling the careful walls both of them had built to protect themselves from further loss. Damien's hand rose to cradle her face, gentle despite the intensity simmering beneath his composed exterior, and for a long moment the reports scattered across his desk and the looming threat from the Western Territories faded into distant, unimportant concerns. When they finally broke apart, breathless and quietly amazed by the depth of feeling that had settled between them, Damien rested his forehead against hers once more, his voice barely above a whisper. I should have told you sooner, he admitted. I was afraid that naming what I felt would somehow make it more vulnerable to loss. I understand that fear better than you might think, Elena said softly. I arrived here believing I had lost everything. My home, my family, my freedom. I never expected to find something worth holding on to within these walls, let alone someone. They remained together long into the evening, conversation flowing easily between them now that the careful distance had finally been bridged, discussing everything from Damien's early years learning to rule alongside his father to Elena's childhood memories of her own pack before the debt had ever forced her into this unexpected path. It was, Elena realized, the first time she had felt truly at peace since her arrival, the fear and uncertainty that once defined her days, replaced by something warmer, steadier, undeniably real. That peace, however, proved short-lived. 3 days later, a scout arrived at the fortress gates in the dead of night, exhausted and bearing grim news. Ashworth had gathered a significant force along the border, larger than any previous mobilization, and intelligence suggested he intended to strike not at the fortress itself, too heavily defended for a direct assault, but at a smaller village within Damien's territory, one with minimal defenses and strategic value for controlling trade routes through the northern mountains. The council convened immediately, urgency replacing the careful deliberation that usually characterized their meetings. Elena stood near the back of the war room once more, watching as Damien studied maps spread across the table, his expression hardening with the weight of decisions that would affect countless lives beyond his own. "We cannot ignore this threat," one advisor argued. "If Ashworth takes the village, he gains a foothold within our territory that will be difficult to reclaim. Sending our full forces leaves the fortress vulnerable," another countered. "This could be a distraction, drawing our warriors away while Ashworth's true target remains here." Damien remained silent for a long moment, weighing the competing concerns before finally speaking. "We split our forces," he said. "A contingent rides to defend the village, while sufficient warriors remain here to protect the fortress against any secondary attempt. I will lead the defense myself." "My king, that is unnecessarily risky," the older advisor protested. "Allow one of your captains to lead the defense while you remain here, where your presence provides the greatest security. My presence in the village will rally its defenders and demonstrate that I do not abandon my people to face threats alone," Damien said firmly, leaving no room for further argument. "I will lead the defense." Elena's chest tightened with familiar dread as the meeting concluded, warriors dispatched to prepare for departure within the hour. She followed Damien to his chamber as he gathered supplies for the journey, unable to keep the worry from her voice as she spoke. "Must you go yourself? Your advisors are not wrong to worry about the risk. I cannot ask my warriors to face danger I am unwilling to face myself," Damien said, checking the weight of his blade before securing it at his side. "That is not the kind of king I wish to be, Elena, nor the kind of mate I wish to be to you." The words settled between them, deliberate and weighted with meaning. Neither of them had fully addressed since their conversation days earlier. Elena crossed the room quickly, gathering him into an embrace that spoke more than words could manage in the limited time remaining before his departure. "Come back to me," she said against his chest, echoing the same request she had made before his previous departure to rescue Anna. "Whatever happens, come back to me." Damien pulled back slightly, cupping her face with both hands, his expression fierce with quiet determination. "I intend to spend a great many years coming back to you, Elena," he said. "This is only the beginning of that promise." He kissed her once more, deep and unhurried despite the urgency awaiting him beyond the chamber walls, before finally pulling away and departing to join his warriors already gathering in the courtyard below. Elena watched from her window as the party rode out into the darkening evening, snow beginning to fall once more, obscuring their figures long before they disappeared entirely from view. She spent the following days in restless anticipation, assisting where she could within the fortress, while news from the village trickled in through exhausted messengers. The defense held longer than Ashworth likely anticipated, Damien's warriors fighting with a determination fueled by loyalty to a king who fought alongside them rather than commanding safely from a distance. But on the fourth day, the news that arrived was not the victory Elena had hoped for. The messenger, barely able to stand from exhaustion, delivered his report with visible reluctance. "The village held," he said, "but during the final push against Ashworth's forces, the king was captured. Ashworth's remaining warriors staged a retreat, drawing our forces into a trap. By the time we realized the deception, the king had already been taken." Elena's world narrowed to a single point of icy panic, the ground seeming to shift beneath her feet as the weight of the messenger's words settled into her chest. Damien, captured, taken by the very enemy who had already attempted to kidnap her once, who now held the Alpha King as leverage against everything he had built. "Where?" she managed to ask, her voice barely steady. "Where have they taken him?" "We believe he has been brought deeper into Ashworth's territory," the messenger said, "toward his primary stronghold. Our forces are regrouping, preparing to pursue, but Ashworth's defenses there are considerably stronger than the outpost we previously breached." Elena did not wait to hear further details before turning toward the war room, her earlier fear transforming rapidly into fierce, unshakable resolve. Whatever it took, whatever risk was required, she intended to ensure that Damien returned to her, exactly as she had made him promise before his departure. The bond between them, still new and only recently acknowledged, pulled at something deep within her chest, an ache that told her plainly that Damien was alive, frightened perhaps for the first time in years, but alive. She intended to keep it that way, regardless of what Ashworth believed capturing the Alpha King might accomplish. The war room filled quickly, as advisors and captains gathered to discuss the crisis, voices overlapping with competing strategies and grim assessments of Ashworth's stronghold. Elena stood at the edge of the table, forcing herself to remain calm despite the fear coursing through her, listening carefully as maps of the Western territories were unrolled once more. "Ashworth's stronghold is heavily fortified," one captain explained, pointing to the map where a cluster of buildings sat nestled deep within mountainous terrain. "A direct assault would cost us considerable losses, and there is no guarantee the king would survive such an approach if Ashworth decides to use him as a shield." "Then we need another approach," Elena said, drawing surprised glances from the gathered advisors, several of whom had not fully grown accustomed to her presence in matters of strategy, despite her earlier contributions during Anna's rescue. "With respect," the older advisor said carefully, "this situation is considerably more complex than locating a single hostage in an abandoned trading post. Ashworth's stronghold is his seat of power, guarded by his most loyal warriors." "I understand the difference," Elena said firmly. "But Ashworth wants something from this capture beyond simply eliminating Damien. If he intended to kill him outright, he would have done so already, rather than transporting him deeper into his territory. He wants leverage, likely to force concessions from our kingdom, perhaps territory or resources." The room fell quiet as the advisors considered her assessment, several exchanging thoughtful glances before the captain who had spoken earlier nodded slowly. "She may be correct. Ashworth would gain little from an immediate execution, particularly given the retaliation it would guarantee from our remaining forces." "Which means," Elena continued, encouraged by the shift in the room's attention, "he likely intends to make demands, which gives us time before any immediate danger to Damien's life, but also means we need to move quickly before those demands escalate beyond anything we could accept." Over the following hours, a plan began to take shape, combining careful diplomatic stalling with covert preparation for a rescue attempt. Messengers were dispatched to open negotiations with Ashworth, buying time while scouts gathered detailed information about the stronghold's defenses, searching for weaknesses that might allow a smaller force to infiltrate rather than risking a costly direct assault. Elena insisted on remaining involved in every stage of planning, her earlier success in locating Anna's captors having earned her a grudging respect among advisors who had once viewed her presence with skepticism. She spent long hours poring over maps, questioning scouts about terrain and patrol patterns, searching for any detail that might prove useful. 3 days into the planning, Ashworth's formal demands arrived via messenger, delivered with the kind of arrogant confidence that suggested he believed himself firmly in control of the situation. He demanded significant territory along the border, control over key trade routes, and a formal acknowledgement of his authority as an independent alpha no longer subject to any obligations toward the cross bloodline. Failure to meet these demands within 2 weeks, the message warned, would result in consequences for the captured king that Ashworth left deliberately vague. The council debated the demands late into the night, several advisors arguing that partial concessions might buy additional time for a rescue attempt, while others worried that any sign of weakness would only embolden Ashworth further. Elena listened to the arguments with growing frustration, aware that time was slipping away while they debated theoretical strategies rather than acting decisively. "We are not going to give him what he wants," she said finally, cutting through the circular debate with sharp determination. "Every day we spend negotiating is another day Damien remains in danger, and every concession we offer only confirms to Ashworth that his strategy is working." "Then what do you propose?" the older advisor asked, though his tone had shifted from skepticism to genuine curiosity regarding her perspective. We use the negotiation as cover, Elena said, exactly as we planned, while our scouts finalize the details necessary for a rescue. We appear to consider his demands seriously enough to prevent him from acting rashly, while preparing to strike before the deadline forces our hand into an impossible choice. The plan was risky, requiring precise timing and considerable coordination among the warriors tasked with the actual infiltration. But the alternative, waiting passively while Ashworth grew increasingly confident in his position, felt far more dangerous to Elena. The council ultimately agreed, authorizing continued negotiation while covert preparations for rescue accelerated behind the scenes. Elena volunteered to accompany the rescue party despite immediate and forceful objections from nearly every advisor present. Absolutely not, the captain, who had initially outlined the stronghold's defenses, said firmly. The risk is far too great, and your capture would only strengthen Ashworth's position considerably. I understand the risk, Elena said, refusing to back down despite the disapproval evident on every face around the table. But I have information no one else possesses. Damien shared details about the fortress's western territories with me during our conversations. Details about old smuggling routes his family once used decades ago that predate current maps. Ashworth's stronghold sits near one such route, according to what Damien described. The revelation shifted the tension in the room considerably, several advisors exchanging surprised glances at the possibility of an alternative approach that might avoid Ashworth's most heavily guarded entrances entirely. Even if such a route exists, the captain said cautiously, leading a rescue party through unfamiliar terrain, based on second-hand information, is an enormous risk. I am not asking to lead anything, Elena clarified. I am asking to accompany the party as a guide, based on what Damien described to me. I will remain with the support elements rather than the direct assault, but I believe this information could mean the difference between success and failure. After considerable debate, the council reluctantly agreed to her involvement, provided she remained under careful guard and away from any direct confrontation with Ashworth's forces. Elena accepted the compromise, understanding the necessity of the restriction, even as impatience gnawed at her chest, desperate to see Damien returned safely, regardless of the personal risk involved. The rescue party departed under cover of darkness 5 days later, moving swiftly through the frozen forests toward Ashworth's territory, while the negotiation continued its careful, deliberate pace back at the fortress, buying precious time. Elena rode among the support elements as promised, her chest tight with anxious anticipation as familiar landmarks Damien had once described in casual conversation began appearing exactly where she expected them. The old smuggling route proved exactly as useful as she had hoped, allowing the rescue party to bypass Ashworth's primary defenses entirely, approaching the stronghold from a direction his warriors had clearly not anticipated needing to guard as heavily. Scouts confirmed the route led to a section of the stronghold's outer wall with minimal patrol coverage, providing an opportunity for infiltration that a direct assault would never have achieved. As the party settled into position under cover of the surrounding forest, preparing for the final approach once darkness fell completely, Elena found herself pulled aside by the captain leading the mission, his expression grave despite the tactical advantage they had gained. Your information has given us a genuine chance at success, he acknowledged. But once the infiltration begins, you must remain here with the support elements. I cannot guarantee your safety if you attempt to follow further, and the mission's success depends on speed and precision that your presence, however well-intentioned, could compromise. Elena understood the necessity of the restriction, though every instinct within her screamed to be closer, to see with her own eyes that Damien remained safe until the moment of his rescue. I understand, she said finally, though the words cost her considerable effort. Bring him back safely. As night fell completely over the forest, the infiltration team moved silently toward the stronghold's outer wall, disappearing into darkness while Elena remained behind with the support elements, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear that made each passing minute feel like an eternity. Somewhere within those fortified walls, Damien waited, uncertain whether rescue would arrive before Ashworth's patience finally ran out entirely. Elena pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the faint, persistent pull of the bond they shared, a quiet reassurance that he remained alive despite the danger surrounding him. She held on to that reassurance as the hours stretched on, praying to whatever forces governed fate and fortune that the plan she had helped construct would succeed in bringing him home. Inside Ashworth's stronghold, Damien sat in a cold stone cell, wrists bound though the restraints had done little to dampen the fury simmering beneath his controlled exterior. He had been held for nearly a week now, fed sparingly, questioned occasionally by Ashworth himself, who seemed to delight in reminding him of the precarious position his capture had created for the Cross bloodline. "Your counsel must be growing desperate," Ashworth had said during his most recent visit, leaning casually against the cell bars with the confidence of a man who believed victory already secured. 2 weeks is not a generous timeline for such significant concessions. "You overestimate what fear will accomplish," Damien had replied evenly, refusing to give Ashworth the satisfaction of visible distress despite the discomfort of his confinement. "My people do not bow easily, regardless of the pressure applied against them." "We shall see," Ashworth had said before departing, leaving Damien alone once more, with only his thoughts and the persistent, aching pull toward Elena that the bond between them made impossible to ignore, even from this distance. He wondered often during the long hours of confinement whether she remained safe, whether his capture had placed additional danger upon her shoulders that he could do nothing to prevent from within these walls. The thought gnawed at him more than any physical discomfort the confinement itself provided, a helplessness he had rarely experienced in his years as king, accustomed as he was to controlling the circumstances around him rather than waiting passively for rescue or ruin. On the night Elena's rescue party finally reached the stronghold, Damien had grown accustomed to the rhythm of his guards' rotation, the quiet stretches between patrols that offered brief moments of near silence within the otherwise watchful confinement. It was during one such quiet stretch that he first noticed something different, a subtle shift in the air, the faint sound of movement along the outer wall that did not match the familiar pattern of Ashworth's regular patrols. He rose carefully, moving toward the small barred window of his cell, straining to identify the source of the disturbance. Shadows moved along the wall in the darkness, deliberate and controlled, unmistakably the movement of trained warriors rather than careless intruders. Hope, cautious and restrained, began building within his chest as he recognized the coordinated precision of the movement, a style of infiltration he himself had trained many of his own warriors to execute. The guards outside his cell were dealt with swiftly and silently, and moments later, the door swung open to reveal familiar faces, warriors from his own household who had risked considerable danger to reach him deep within enemy territory. "My king," the captain leading the rescue whispered urgently, immediately working to free him from his restraints. "We must move quickly, before the change in guard rotation reveals our presence." "How did you locate this cell so precisely?" Damien asked, rubbing at his freed wrists as he followed the captain toward the corridor beyond, senses sharpening with renewed purpose now that escape seemed genuinely possible. "Elena," the captain said simply. "She recalled details you shared about old smuggling routes near this territory, information that allowed us to bypass Ashworth's primary defenses entirely." Something warm and fierce settled into Damien's chest at the mention of her name, gratitude and pride intertwining with the protective instinct that had driven him to lead the defense of the village in the first place, an instinct that had ultimately led to his capture, but had also, apparently, kept his people safe from the larger assault Ashworth might otherwise have attempted. "She is here?" Damien asked, alarm sharpening his voice despite his relief at the news of imminent rescue. "With the support elements, remaining at a safe distance as instructed," the captain assured him. She insisted on accompanying the mission, but agreed to remain away from direct danger. Relief and lingering worry warred within Damien as they moved carefully through the stronghold's corridors, avoiding patrols with practiced precision, retracing the path that had allowed the rescue team to infiltrate undetected. They reached the outer wall without incident, slipping through the same gap in Ashworth's defenses that had permitted their entrance, disappearing into the surrounding forest just as the first signs of alarm began stirring within the stronghold behind them, guards discovering the empty cell far too late to mount an effective pursuit. The journey back toward the waiting support elements felt both endless and far too brief to Damien, urgency propelling their pace even as exhaustion from his confinement began weighing heavily against his usual endurance. When they finally reached the tree line where Elena waited, he saw her before she saw him, standing tense and alert among the support warriors, her eyes scanning the darkness with barely restrained anxiety. The moment she spotted him, whatever composure she had maintained during the anxious wait shattered entirely. She rushed forward, closing the distance between them with a speed that left the surrounding warriors momentarily startled, throwing herself into his arms with enough force that he nearly stumbled backward despite his considerable strength. "You came for me," Damien murmured against her hair, holding her tightly, the weight of his relief finally settling fully now that she was solid and real within his arms, rather than merely a distant hope sustained through the ache of their bond. "Of course I came," Elena said, her voice thick with emotion she made no attempt to hide. "I promised myself I would not lose you to Ashworth's ambitions, regardless of what it required." They remained embraced for a long moment before the captain gently reminded them of the continued danger surrounding their position, urging the party to move quickly before Ashworth's forces organized a pursuit. Damien reluctantly released her, though his hand found hers immediately, refusing to fully separate even as they mounted horses and began the journey back toward the fortress under the cover of remaining darkness. The ride back proved considerably tenser than the initial journey toward Ashworth's territory, scouts reporting signs of pursuit within hours of their departure from the stronghold. Ashworth, furious at the unexpected rescue and the loss of his primary leverage, had mobilized his remaining forces to pursue the fleeing party, determined to recapture Damien or at minimum inflict significant losses upon the retreating warriors. The pursuit forced difficult decisions upon the rescue party, requiring them to abandon the slower, more direct route back toward the fortress in favor of a longer path through more treacherous terrain that Ashworth's forces would find harder to navigate quickly. Damien, still weakened from his confinement despite his best efforts to conceal the extent of his exhaustion, insisted on remaining alert and engaged in the strategic decisions guiding their retreat, though Elena noticed the strain evident in his expression during quieter moments when he believed himself unobserved. "You need rest," she said during a brief stop to water the horses, concern evident in her voice as she studied the pallor beneath his usually composed features. "You have been through considerable ordeal, and pushing yourself further will only worsen your condition." "There will be time to rest once we are safely within our own territory," Damien said, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. "Ashworth's forces will not simply abandon pursuit because I am tired." Elena did not argue further, understanding the necessity that drove his continued determination, though she remained close beside him throughout the remainder of the journey, offering quiet support and occasional insistence that he accept water or brief moments of rest whenever the pursuit allowed even minimal opportunity. They crossed back into cross territory as dawn broke over the eastern mountains, Ashworth's pursuing forces finally abandoning the chase as they neared the border, unwilling to risk direct confrontation within territory that would summon considerable reinforcement from Damien's remaining warriors. The relief that swept through the rescue party as familiar landmarks came into view was palpable. Exhausted warriors finally allowing themselves to relax slightly now that immediate danger had passed. Damien, however, finally succumbed to the exhaustion he had been fighting throughout the journey, swaying dangerously in his saddle as they approached the final stretch toward the fortress. Elena caught his arm just in time, alarm flooding through her as she signaled urgently for assistance from the surrounding warriors. "He needs immediate attention," she called out, helping steady him as concerned warriors gathered around, several dismounting quickly to assist in easing him safely from his horse. The remainder of the journey passed in an anxious blur, Elena remaining close beside Damien as warriors half carried him the final distance toward the fortress gates. Healers, already alerted, and waiting to provide immediate treatment for the combination of exhaustion, minor injuries, and the lingering effects of insufficient nourishment during his confinement. As healers worked to stabilize him within his private chamber, Elena remained close by, refusing to leave despite gentle suggestions from Lily and the healers that she rest after her own exhausting ordeal. She held his hand throughout the treatment, watching anxiously as color slowly returned to his features, relief building gradually as the healers assured her that his condition, while serious, was not life-threatening, requiring only rest and proper nourishment to fully recover. It was late in the evening, the fortress finally settling into quiet after the chaos of the rescue and subsequent pursuit, when Damien finally stirred fully awake, finding Elena seated beside his bed, exhaustion evident on her own features, despite her refusal to leave his side. "You should be resting," he murmured, his voice rough from days of insufficient water during his confinement. "I could not rest until I knew you would recover," Elena said, relief evident in her tired smile as she leaned closer, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "You gave me quite a fright, collapsing during our final approach to the fortress." "I apologize for the concern," Damien said, though a faint, genuine smile crossed his own features despite his exhaustion. "Though I suspect the fright was mutual, given your insistence on accompanying a rescue mission despite considerable danger." "We are even, then," Elena said softly, settling more comfortably beside his bed, her hand still clasped within his. "Though I would prefer we avoid such dramatic circumstances in the future, if possible." "I will endeavor to accommodate that preference," Damien said, exhaustion finally pulling him back toward much-needed sleep, though not before he added, quiet and sincere, "Thank you, Elena, for everything. For the smuggling route, for insisting on accompanying the mission despite the danger, for simply being here when I woke." "Always," Elena said softly, watching as sleep finally claimed him fully, his features relaxing into peaceful rest, for what felt like the first time since his capture nearly a week earlier. As she sat beside him through the quiet hours of the night, Elena reflected on how thoroughly her life had transformed since arriving at the fortress, as payment for a debt she never chose to owe. What had begun as punishment had become, through circumstances neither of them could have predicted, something far more precious and unshakable than either had initially believed possible. Ashworth's threat remained, undoubtedly plotting further schemes to weaken the cross-bloodline's authority, but for the moment, within the quiet safety of Damien's chamber, Elena allowed herself simply to feel grateful that he had returned to her, exactly as he had promised before his departure, toward what nearly became a far more permanent separation. Damien's recovery took nearly 2 weeks, during which Elena rarely left his side, tending to him alongside the fortress healers despite his repeated insistence that he required far less attention than he was receiving. The fortress itself buzzed with renewed energy following his safe return, warriors and advisors alike relieved that their king had escaped Ashworth's captivity without lasting harm, though the underlying threat from the Western territories remained a persistent concern hanging over every conversation. The council convened once Damien regained sufficient strength to participate fully, the discussion turning quickly toward how best to address Ashworth's continued aggression now that his attempt to use the king as leverage had failed so spectacularly. Elena, whose contributions during the rescue had earned her a permanent seat at these gatherings, despite the lingering skepticism of a few older advisors, listened carefully as various strategies were debated. "Ashworth will not simply retreat quietly after this failure," the captain who had led the rescue observed. "His pride has been wounded, and wounded pride often drives desperate action. Then we must ensure any further action he attempts meets swift and decisive resistance," Damien said, his voice carrying renewed strength despite the toll his captivity had taken. "I will not allow this threat to linger indefinitely, endangering my people and territory each time Ashworth grows restless. The discussion that followed outlined a coordinated response, gathering allied packs throughout the northern territories who had grown similarly frustrated with Ashworth's escalating aggression over recent years. Word was sent to neighboring alphas, many of whom had maintained cautious neutrality in the past, but now recognized the necessity of unified action against a threat that clearly would not diminish on its own. Over the following month, Elena watched as Damien worked tirelessly to build this coalition, traveling when his strength allowed to meet personally with allied alphas, using diplomacy rather than force wherever possible, while preparing thoroughly for the possibility that Ashworth would ultimately require a more direct confrontation. She accompanied him on several of these journeys, her presence beside him no longer questioned or hidden, but openly acknowledged, a partnership that had grown far beyond the boundaries of their initial, unwilling arrangement. During one such journey to meet with an allied alpha from the Eastern Territories, Elena found herself seated beside Damien in a formal gathering hall, observing as he navigated careful negotiations with practiced skill she had come to admire deeply over their months together. The alpha they were meeting, a woman named Charlotte who ruled her territory with sharp intelligence and equally sharp wit, studied Elena curiously throughout the proceedings. "Your companion is unusually perceptive for someone unfamiliar with formal diplomacy," Charlotte observed during a brief pause in negotiations, addressing Damien directly, though her gaze remained on Elena. "Elena's insights have proven invaluable on more than one occasion," Damien replied, a note of pride evident in his voice that made warmth spread through Elena's chest, despite the formal setting. "I would not have survived my capture without the information she provided for my rescue." Charlotte's expression shifted, genuine interest replacing polite curiosity as she turned her full attention toward Elena. "Is this the same companion I have heard rumors about?" "The one given as debt payment, who has apparently become something considerably more significant." Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks at the direct question, though she held Charlotte's gaze steadily rather than looking away in embarrassment. "The rumors are likely accurate," she said simply, "though I would say the relationship developed rather than being predetermined by the circumstances of my arrival." "A refreshingly honest answer," Charlotte said, something like approval crossing her features. "I have found that arrangements built on genuine connection tend to prove far more durable than those constructed purely for political convenience. It bodes well for your alliance against Ashworth, I think, having a king willing to acknowledge such things openly, rather than hiding behind careful denial." The negotiations concluded successfully that evening, Charlotte agreeing to commit warriors toward the coalition forming against Ashworth's aggression, and as they prepared to depart the following morning, she pulled Elena aside briefly, away from the bustle of warriors preparing horses and supplies. "Whatever challenges lie ahead in confronting Ashworth," Charlotte said quietly, "I suspect you will prove yourself a considerable asset, not merely as the king's companion, but in your own right. Do not let anyone within his court convince you otherwise." The words settled warmly into Elena's chest as they continued their journey back toward the fortress, and she found herself reflecting on how thoroughly her sense of self had transformed since her arrival months earlier. She was no longer merely the girl handed over as payment for her father's debt, uncertain of her place or purpose within a world that had never asked for her opinion on anything. She had become someone whose insights were sought, whose contributions mattered, whose voice carried weight even among alphas who ruled their own territories with considerable authority. Back at the fortress, preparations for the coalition against Ashworth continued steadily, warriors from allied packs beginning to gather along the border in a show of unified strength, intended to discourage further aggression before direct conflict became necessary. Damien's health had fully recovered by this point, though Elena noticed he remained more cautious than before his captivity, more deliberate in weighing risks that he might once have accepted without hesitation. One evening, as they walked together along the fortress walls overlooking the gathering coalition forces below, Damien turned to her with an expression more serious than she had seen since his return. "Elena," he said carefully, "I have been considering something, and I wish to discuss it with you before proceeding further." That sounds ominous, Elena said, though she kept her tone light despite the sudden nervous flutter in her chest. Not ominous, Damien assured her, a faint smile crossing his features, though perhaps significant. I wish to formally acknowledge our bond before my court and the allied alphas gathering for the coalition against Ashworth. Not merely as a private understanding between us, but as a public declaration of your status as my intended mate. Elena's breath caught at the weight of his words, understanding immediately the political significance such a declaration would carry. Your advisors worried once that my presence here weakened your authority, she said carefully. Would such a public declaration not provide Ashworth and others further ammunition against you? Perhaps, Damien acknowledged. But I have grown tired of careful denial and diplomatic evasion regarding something I know to be true beyond any doubt. You saved my life, Elena, through your intelligence and your courage, and you have proven yourself invaluable to this kingdom time and again since your arrival. I no longer wish to treat our bond as something requiring justification or explanation to anyone, including my own counsel. Elena studied him carefully, searching for any hesitation or doubt that might suggest this decision stemmed from momentary emotion rather than genuine conviction. She found none, only steady, unwavering certainty in his golden eyes, the same certainty that had guided his decisions since the moment they first began growing closer during their early training sessions. I would be honored, she said finally, emotion thick in her voice, to be formally acknowledged as your mate, before your court, and anyone else who might question the bond we share. Relief and joy mingled openly across Damien's expression, a rare display of unguarded emotion that made Elena's heart swell with affection for the man who had transformed so completely from the distant, ruthless king she had first encountered upon her arrival. He pulled her close, pressing a lingering kiss to her lips, beneath the darkening sky, the gathering coalition forces below serving as unlikely witnesses to a moment that would soon reshape both their private understanding and the political landscape of the Northern Territories entirely. There is one matter we must address before any formal declaration, Damien said as they finally broke apart, his expression growing more serious once more. Your father's pack and the original debt that brought you here. I wish to formally release them from any remaining obligation and ensure your family understands the transformation your circumstances have undergone since your arrival. Elena had not considered her family in some time, the demands of her new life within the fortress having consumed most of her attention and energy. The mention of them now brought a complicated mixture of emotions, lingering resentment at being surrendered so easily as payment for their failures, mingled with genuine curiosity about how they might react to learning of her current circumstances. I would like that, she said finally, though I admit uncertainty about how they might respond to such news. Whatever their reaction, Damien said firmly, know that your place here is secure regardless of their opinion. You belong to this fortress and to this kingdom now, not through obligation or debt, but through choice, both mine and yours. The formal declaration was scheduled for the following month, timed to coincide with a gathering of the allied alphas, preparing their coordinated response against Ashworth's continued aggression. Elena spent the intervening weeks in a whirlwind of preparation, learning the traditions and expectations surrounding such a significant announcement while continuing to contribute to the strategic planning against the looming conflict with Ashworth's forces. As the day of the declaration approached, Elena found herself reflecting often on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the terrified girl dragged through the fortress gates as punishment for her father's debt, to the woman about to be formally acknowledged as mate to the Alpha King of the Northern Territories. The path had been far from simple, marked by danger and uncertainty at nearly every turn, but standing now at the threshold of a future she never could have imagined during those early, frightened days of her captivity, Elena felt only gratitude for the unexpected turns her life had taken. Whatever challenges Ashworth and his continued aggression might still present, she faced them now not as a helpless prisoner awaiting an uncertain fate, but as a woman who had claimed her own place within a kingdom that had once seemed determined to consume her entirely, and who had, against every expectation, found not punishment, but genuine belonging within its walls. The Great Hall had never looked more magnificent than it did on the morning of the formal declaration. Banners from every Allied territory hanging alongside the traditional black and silver of the Cross bloodline. Warriors and dignitaries from across the northern territories gathered to witness a moment that carried significance far beyond a simple personal announcement. Elena stood in a private chamber adjoining the hall, Lily fussing over the final details of her appearance, while nervous anticipation coiled tightly in her stomach. "You look every bit as regal as any queen this territory has known," Lily said, stepping back to admire her handiwork, genuine pride evident in her voice. "Who would have imagined, all those months ago when you first arrived, that this is where your path would lead?" "Certainly not me," Elena admitted, studying her reflection with a mixture of nervousness and quiet determination. The gown she wore, deep blue trimmed with silver thread matching the Cross bloodline's traditional colors, felt like a physical manifestation of how thoroughly her life had transformed since those early, frightened days. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and Lily hurried to answer it, revealing Damien standing in the corridor beyond, dressed formally in his own ceremonial attire, looking every bit the powerful Alpha King his reputation suggested, though the warmth in his golden eyes as they settled on Elena belonged only to the man she had come to know beneath that formidable exterior. "You are stunning," he said simply, crossing the room to take her hands in his, admiration evident in every line of his expression. "You are not so bad yourself," Elena replied, though her attempt at lightness could not fully disguise the nervous tremor in her voice. "Are you certain about this?" Damien asked, searching her face carefully. "Once this declaration is made, there will be no retreating from it, no quiet reconsideration if circumstances grow difficult. I want you to enter this commitment with complete certainty, not merely because you feel obligated by everything we have shared." Elena squeezed his hands gently, meeting his gaze with steady conviction. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life, Damien. What began as punishment has become the truest home I have ever known, and you have become the truest partner I could have ever hoped to find, even in circumstances I would never have chosen for myself." Relief and love mingled openly across his features, and he pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead before offering his arm to escort her toward the great hall where their gathered court and allies awaited. The hall fell silent as they entered together, every eye turning toward the couple as they made their way down the long central aisle toward the raised platform where Damien's throne sat alongside a second, newly added chair that had not existed during Elena's earlier visits to this same hall as a frightened, uncertain prisoner. The symbolism was not lost on her, nor on the assembled court, murmurs of recognition rippling through the gathered crowd as they processed the significance of what they were witnessing. Damien addressed the assembly once they reached the platform, his voice carrying clearly through the vast hall with the authority Elena had come to associate with him during official proceedings, though warmth remained evident beneath the formal cadence of his words. "Many of you remember the circumstances that first brought Elena Voss to this fortress," he began, "surrendered as payment for debts owed by her father's pack, a punishment decreed by the council to maintain balance and consequence within our territories. I will not pretend those circumstances were anything other than what they were, difficult and unchosen for both of us." He paused, his gaze finding Elena's, warmth and certainty evident in his expression as he continued. "But circumstances, however they begin, do not always determine where they ultimately lead. In the months since her arrival, Elena has proven herself time and again to be more than any debt payment or political obligation. She saved my life during Ashworth's assassination attempt within these very walls. Her intelligence and courage were instrumental in the successful rescue of both Anna and myself from Ashworth's captivity. She has earned the respect of Allied Alphas through her insight and integrity, and she has earned something far more significant within my own heart, a bond I believed myself incapable of experiencing again after the loss of my first mate." The hall remained utterly silent, every gathered guest hanging on his words as he turned fully to face Elena, taking both her hands in his once more before the entire assembly. Before this court, before our allies gathered to support our kingdom against the threats we face together, I formally acknowledge Elena Voss as my mate, chosen not through obligation or debt, but through genuine bond and unshakable devotion. What began as punishment has become, through her own strength and character, my greatest source of hope and my truest partnership. Elena felt tears gathering despite her best efforts at composure, the weight of his words and the significance of the moment overwhelming the careful calm she had maintained throughout the preparations. She managed to find her own voice, addressing the assembled court with as much steadiness as she could muster. I arrived at this fortress believing my life had ended, that whatever future I might have hoped for had been stolen by circumstances beyond my control, she said. Instead, I found not an ending but a beginning, a chance to become someone stronger and more capable than I ever imagined possible. I found, in Damian Cross, not the ruthless king the stories described, but a partner of genuine honor and unexpected gentleness beneath his formidable exterior. I accept this bond not out of obligation, but out of genuine love and profound respect for the man he has proven himself to be, and I pledge my loyalty and devotion to this kingdom and its people alongside him. The hall erupted into applause and cheers, the assembled allies and court members rising to their feet in recognition of the formal bond now sealed between their king and the woman who had transformed from unwilling captive to acknowledged mate through nothing more than her own unwavering character and courage. Charlotte, seated among the allied alphas, caught Elena's eye across the hall with a knowing, approving smile, a silent acknowledgement of the conversation they had shared weeks earlier. The celebration that followed extended long into the evening, the great hall transformed with feast and music as the assembled guests toasted the newly acknowledged bond and the coalition forming to address Ashworth's continued threat. Elena found herself swept from one conversation to another, meeting allied alphas and their representatives, each expressing genuine warmth and respect that had been noticeably absent during her earliest, uncertain days within the fortress. Later in the evening, as the celebration continued around them, Damian pulled Elena aside to a quiet balcony overlooking the fortress grounds, the coalition warriors' campfires visible in the distance, twinkling like scattered stars against the darkened landscape below. "How does it feel?" he asked, "to be formally acknowledged before an entire court, after everything we have endured to reach this moment?" "Surreal," Elena admitted, leaning into his embrace as they watched the distant campfires together. "I keep waiting to wake and discover this entire journey was nothing more than an elaborate dream, that I am still that frightened girl being dragged through the fortress gates for the first time." "I promise you this is no dream," Damian said softly, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Though I understand the sentiment. There were many nights during those early months when I questioned whether I deserved a second chance at this kind of happiness, after losing Margaret so unexpectedly. Your arrival, however unwilling it began, taught me that grief and love are not mutually exclusive, that honoring the past does not require forsaking the possibility of future happiness." "Ashworth remains a threat," Elena said quietly, practical concerns intruding gently upon the peaceful moment. "This declaration, as significant as it feels tonight, does not erase the danger still facing our kingdom." "No," Damian agreed. "But we face that danger now as a unified front, with allies committed to our cause and a bond between us that Ashworth's schemes have proven unable to break, despite his best efforts. Whatever comes next, we will face it together, as equal partners rather than a king burdened alone by responsibility." Elena turned in his embrace, meeting his gaze with quiet determination matching his own. "Then let him come," she said. "We have faced his aggression before and emerged stronger for it. I have no doubt we will do so again, whatever challenges still await us." Below them, the coalition campfires continued burning steadily against the darkness, a visible reminder of the strength now gathered in defense of their kingdom, while above, stars scattered across the clear winter sky, distant and constant. Much like the bond that had grown between a king who once ruled through careful distance and duty alone, and a woman who had arrived as punishment but had become, through her own remarkable strength and unwavering heart, his truest partner and his greatest source of hope for whatever future still lay ahead. News of the formal declaration spread quickly beyond the fortress walls, carried by messengers and travelers throughout the northern territories until it inevitably reached Ashworth himself, deep within his western stronghold. The response came swiftly, a final, desperate gambit from an alpha who understood clearly that his window for exploiting any perceived weakness in Damien's rule had closed entirely now that allied forces stood unified behind the newly acknowledged bond. Rather than risk the accumulated coalition forces gathered along the border, Ashworth attempted one final act of sabotage, sending a small group of infiltrators toward the fortress itself under cover of a supply caravan, intending to strike directly at the heart of Cross authority before the full weight of Allied resistance could be brought against his territory. The attempt, however, proved far less successful than his previous schemes. Elena, now fully integrated into the fortress's strategic planning and security discussions, had insisted on strengthening exactly the kind of vulnerability Ashworth's men attempted to exploit, remembering all too well how her own kidnapping attempt against Anna had succeeded through similarly disguised infiltration. The additional scrutiny applied to incoming caravans identified the disguised warriors before they could execute whatever plan Ashworth had devised, and they were captured swiftly, providing valuable intelligence about his remaining forces and increasingly desperate state of mind. With this final scheme exposed and neutralized, and the coalition forces along the border demonstrating overwhelming strength that Ashworth's diminished resources could not hope to match, the Western Alpha found himself facing a stark choice between formal surrender or complete destruction of his remaining territory and forces. Faced with this reality, and abandoned by several of his own advisors who recognized the futility of continued resistance, Ashworth ultimately agreed to terms brokered through careful negotiation, relinquishing significant territory and formally acknowledging the authority of the Cross bloodline over the disputed border regions. The formal surrender ceremony took place weeks later, a considerably less celebratory affair than Elena and Damien's earlier declaration, though no less significant in its implications for the future stability of the northern territories. Elena stood beside Damien as Ashworth, stripped of much of his former arrogance, formally acknowledged defeat before the assembled coalition, the long shadow of conflict that had hung over their bond since its earliest days, finally beginning to lift. "It is over," Elena said quietly as they watched Ashworth's diminished party depart following the ceremony, relief evident in her voice despite the exhaustion of months spent navigating danger and uncertainty. "This particular conflict, certainly," Damien agreed, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as they turned back toward the fortress. "Though ruling a kingdom rarely offers permanent peace from all challenges, there will be other difficulties, other threats requiring our attention in the years ahead." "I know," Elena said, leaning into his embrace. "But I find I am no longer afraid of whatever challenges might come, not with you beside me, and not with the strength we have built together through everything Ashworth attempted to use against us." Spring arrived early that year, the harsh winter finally giving way to warmer winds and the first tentative signs of new growth across the fortress grounds. Elena found herself spending more time outdoors as the weather improved, walking the same courtyard where she had first learned to defend herself under Damien's careful instruction, though now she moved with confidence and skill that would have seemed impossible to the frightened girl who had arrived at these gates so many months earlier. Her relationship with the fortress and its people had transformed just as thoroughly as her relationship with Damien himself. Lily had become a genuine friend rather than merely a servant assigned to her care, and the warriors who had once eyed her with suspicion now greeted her with the easy familiarity reserved for someone who had proven herself a valued member of their community. Even the advisors who had initially resisted her involvement in matters of state had come to respect her insight, several openly acknowledging that her contributions during the crisis with Ashworth had proven more valuable than they had ever anticipated. One afternoon, as Elena sat in the library working through correspondence with several Allied territories, a task Damien had increasingly entrusted to her, given her talent for diplomatic communication. A messenger arrived bearing news from her childhood village, the first direct word she had received from her family since her arrival at the fortress many months earlier. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal on the letter, uncertain what emotions to expect as she read her father's careful, formal handwriting. The letter expressed genuine gratitude for Damien's decision to formally release the pack from any remaining debt obligations, along with cautious inquiries about her well-being and circumstances within the fortress. There was an apology as well, awkward and incomplete, but genuine in its acknowledgement of the difficulty her surrender had caused, and hope that she might find happiness despite the circumstances that had brought her to this unexpected path. Elena read the letter several times, processing the complicated mixture of emotions it stirred within her, lingering resentment at the ease with which her family had surrendered her, mingling with genuine relief that they had not simply forgotten her existence entirely once the debt was settled. She composed a careful response that evening, describing her transformed circumstances honestly, the genuine happiness she had found despite the unwanted beginning of her journey, and an invitation for them to visit the fortress should they wish to see for themselves how thoroughly her life had changed. When she shared the correspondence with Damien later that evening, he read her response carefully before looking up with quiet understanding in his golden eyes. "You do not owe them forgiveness," he said gently, "regardless of how thoroughly your circumstances here have improved. Their decision to surrender you as payment remains a difficult truth, whatever peace you may have found since." "I know," Elena said. "I am not certain I have fully forgiven them, not entirely, but I find I no longer wish to carry that resentment as heavily as I once did. Whatever their reasons, whatever failures led to that decision, it ultimately brought me here, to you, to this life I never expected but have come to treasure deeply. I cannot fully regret a path that led to such an outcome, even if I wish it had unfolded differently." Damien pulled her close, understanding evident in his embrace, without need for further words. They remained together in comfortable silence for a long while, the fire crackling nearby, the correspondence and complicated emotions of the day settling gradually into quiet acceptance. As the months continued to pass, Elena's role within the fortress and the broader northern territories continued expanding, her formal status as Damien's acknowledged mate opening opportunities for genuine leadership that extended far beyond simply supporting her partner's rule. She began working directly with Allied territories on trade agreements and diplomatic relations, her natural instinct for careful strategy and genuine empathy proving invaluable in negotiations that required both firmness and understanding. Charlotte, the Eastern Alpha who had first recognized Elena's potential during their earlier negotiations, became a genuine friend and mentor, offering guidance as Elena navigated the complexities of her expanding responsibilities within the kingdom. Their correspondence grew frequent, discussing everything from formal diplomatic matters to the more personal challenges of building a life alongside a partner who carried the weight of an entire kingdom's welfare upon his shoulders. One evening, nearly a year after her initial arrival at the fortress gates, as punishment for her father's debt, Elena stood once more at the edge of the wall overlooking the forest below, the same spot where Damien had first admitted his growing feelings toward her during those early, uncertain weeks of their relationship. The forest had changed considerably with the passing seasons, snow long since melted, summer's full green now beginning to shift toward the golden tones of approaching autumn once more, a full cycle of seasons completed since her difficult arrival. Damien joined her there, as he often did during quiet evenings, when the demands of ruling allowed brief moments of respite, wrapping his arms around her from behind as they both watched the sun begin its descent toward the distant mountains. "A year ago tonight," Elena said softly. I sat in a locked chamber within these walls, uncertain whether I would survive the week, let alone imagine a future here. And now? Damien asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer, simply wishing to hear her articulate it once more. Now, Elena said, turning within his embrace to meet his gaze directly. I cannot imagine any future that does not include this fortress, these people, and most importantly, you. What began as the cruelest punishment I could have imagined has become the truest gift my life has ever offered, though I would never have believed such a transformation possible during those early, frightened days. I feel precisely the same, Damien said, his voice thick with emotion. He no longer felt any need to guard carefully against her. You arrived here as payment for a debt neither of us chose, and yet you have become, through your own remarkable strength and unwavering heart, everything I never believed myself capable of finding again after loss, convinced me such happiness belonged only to my past. You are not merely my mate, Elena. You are my partner, my equal, and my greatest source of strength in facing whatever challenges this kingdom still holds for us in the years ahead. Elena rose slightly to meet his lips in a kiss that carried the weight of everything they had endured together. Every danger faced and overcome, every careful wall dismantled through patient honesty and genuine connection. Behind them, the fortress that had once represented her greatest fear now stood as the truest home she had ever known. Its stone walls no longer a prison, but a sanctuary, built through resilience, courage, and a bond that had transformed punishment into the deepest devotion either of them had ever known. As darkness settled fully over the northern territories that evening, the fortress lights beginning to glow warmly against the gathering dusk, Elena understood with complete certainty that whatever the future held, whatever challenges still awaited a king and his chosen mate ruling together over a kingdom slowly healing from years of conflict and uncertainty, she would face it all without hesitation, standing beside the man who had transformed from her captor into her everything, exactly as fate, however cruel its opening chapter, had always intended.